invitation to join you here today. It's exciting to be speaking in this context to these practice groups. Actually, we had the practice groups on our webinar series just a few weeks ago to talk about what it's like to practice online, and that was great. So it's great to be back in a very different capacity, talking to you not so much about technology, but rather about languages, which, as you know, is something we love. I think it's something that everybody in this room loves. After all, that's why you're here. That's why you're interpreters. So maybe I'll just say hi to Alex. Hey, Alex, how's it going?
Hey Josh, how are you? It's wonderful to be here as well. Thank you to the study groups for inviting us today for that. Thank you to the practice groups. It's great to be here. And as Josh said, we are trying to do things a little bit differently. But I think before we get into that, we should probably briefly introduce ourselves for those of you who don't know us yet. So since I have the floor, I might just start as well. So my name is Alexander Drechsel. I'm from Germany. I'm a conference interpreter and have been for many years now. So to keep this brief, my A language is German, my B language is English, and then I also work with French and Romanian, and currently working on adding Russian. What about your languages, Josh?
Thanks, Alex. So I am Josh Goldsmith, born and bred in the US, in Florida, and currently residing in Geneva, Switzerland. And as you may have guessed, I work into English from a whole raft of Romance languages, Spanish, French, Italian, Catalan, and I am working on my Portuguese right now. And I'm sure that over the course of the next 25 minutes or so, you'll hear from both of us about how we're going about working on learning new languages. In fact, that's what we want to talk about today. As you may have noticed, we've entitled this session Techforward Heart Emoji Words. So we'll be talking about why we decided to entitle this Heart Emoji Words, and we'll talk about all sorts of things related to words, languages, language acquisition, maybe a little bit of linguistics. On that point, I think I'll start by telling you a little bit about my background, because I actually hold a degree in linguistics. My bachelor's degree was in linguistics, concretely in historical linguistics and language acquisition. So I know a thing or two about how languages change and how people learn languages, which is my first passion. After that, I made my way to Europe. I did a master's degree in the teaching of languages and literatures at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. So I lived in Barcelona for a few years, which is where I picked up Catalan as part of my language combination. And then I bounced around from place to place to place. I actually went back to the US briefly, taught bilingual high school, Spanish-English for a year, then moved to Italy, spent a long time living in Italy, in Venice, which is gorgeous. And after that, moved to Geneva to train as a conference interpreter. And I've been here ever since. What about you, Alex? You've also bounced around a bit over the years, haven't you?
I haven't bounced across the Atlantic though. Yeah, but I have moved around a little bit, indeed. So I grew up in Eastern Germany in the 80s. Let's just leave it at that. And I always say that I grew up on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. So traveling around the world wasn't really an option back then, which it wasn't a big problem because I was still very small and very young, so it's not something that I missed necessarily. But for some reason or another, I always found myself being quite good at languages, much better than sports or maths or other sciences. And so I sort of focused on that and actually went to a school that was specialized. I had a particular focus on foreign languages, and my first foreign language was English, surprisingly. So I was young enough to not be part of the generation that had to learn Russian as a mandatory foreign language, which was the case before the wall came down, obviously. So I had the chance, I guess, of being able to start with English. But since this was very early days for English, in a way, that meant that I had two teachers as my first English teachers who weren't really qualified to teach English at all. One of them was a former Russian teacher who just had to, from one day to the next switch over to teaching English. And you can imagine how well that went. And the other two, they were both great people, but they were just thrown in at the deep end in a way. And the other English teacher was a former teacher of music and religion. But he had to switch over to English as well, and he was not very good at it, which he admitted freely. But there you go. I wasn't off to a particularly great start, but things improved from there on. And then I think my second foreign language was French. And my third one was then Russian, because I was in this sort of special school where there were lots of foreign languages. And I even dabbled a little bit in Latin as a sort of extracurricular activity. At some
Can one
point,
actually dabble in
no,
Latin?
no, but I did, and you can imagine how successful it was. So I don't really have a degree or any kind of certificate in Latin. I just spent some time sitting in Latin class. I think that's a more accurate description of what actually happened. So yeah, but I was exposed to foreign languages very early on, which kind of brings me to the elephant in the room that I wanted to address, because when it comes to stereotypes and cliches, at least Americans are not necessarily known as being very fond of learning foreign languages. So I'm kind of wondering what went wrong with you, Josh?
Okay, you've just called me the elephant in the room and said something went wrong in my background, Alex.
I
Wonderful.
was being
Thanks a lot.
facetious, of
I know
course.
you're being facetious. Um, yeah, I think it was just like you. I've always loved languages. That was my passion. I have other passions. Some of you who know me, and there are plenty of familiar faces in the room, so hello to you all. Uh, some of you who know me know that I have quite a few passions. I love to sing. I'm currently founding a chorus in Geneva, which is kind of crazy at this particular moment in time, but hey, that's life. I like random things like juggling. I also love to cook and read and so on, but one of my favorite subjects in school was always foreign languages. And my first foreign language was Spanish. I was lucky enough that my grandmother was actually born in Guatemala. So unfortunately, we didn't grow up speaking Spanish, but I had somebody to practice with. So that was quite a bit of fun. I mean, she would pick me up to drive me to Taekwondo. There's another random hobby of mine. And we would speak in Spanish in the car on the way there. And I think that all of this sort of just was a lot of fun. So it clearly was fun because by the time I hit 7th grade, I said, all right, enough. I'm going to add another language. Of course, we didn't call it adding a language in interpreter speak at that point. I just said, hey, I want to learn French. And so I started learning French. And by the end of high school, I had taken the AP exams in both Spanish and French. For those of you who aren't familiar with the American system, those are advanced placement exams worth college credit, depending on where you go. So I guess I just started early, and then I went off to college, and that's where I really started to mop up languages. I think in rapid fire succession, I took Italian, Portuguese, Hebrew, no, German first, then Hebrew. I studied abroad in Israel for 6 months, which was great, and Arabic. And when I was living in Israel, I actually also I was living with Arabic speakers. So that was the beginning. Then I went off to Barcelona, learned Catalan. And I mean, is there an elephant in the room? I just love languages. I think that that's allowed. And, some of
That's
the
totally
languages
okay. Yeah.
some of the languages that I learned, I actually learned because they had great teachers. So I wasn't planning on learning German. I happened to decide to learn German because I was studying language acquisition. My bachelor's thesis was on third language acquisition. So people who already speak two languages, how they go about learning a third language. And I said, well, I'm going to interview lots of professors about this and also do a lot of work with students and ran a survey and all that jazz. And this led me to take German and also advanced courses on language acquisition and language teaching with the German teacher because he was an expert in language acquisition and his courses were incredible. Wow, I've never learned so much so fast or been taught so well. So you were talking about some pretty poor teachers that you had early on for English, but in
Yeah.
my case, I actually had an excellent German teacher, which was the reason I decided to learn German. What about you? I mean,
I had
what have your teachers been like? Have they been good? Has it been a positive experience? Has it been a mixed bag?
It's been of a mixed bag, I think. So again, as I said, off to a bad start, but I certainly had great foreign language teachers in school. So for example, my first Russian teacher was fantastic. She really loved Russian, and she was able to sort of convey that love and that passion for the language, but also for the culture, the music, and everything to us in class, which is not easy in school. I admire language, I mean, school teachers in general, but particularly languages. But she did an excellent job. And I think she's sort of one of the reasons why I stuck with Russian all these years. I mean, with some interruptions, but that's a different story. But she really was able to sort of convey that passion and sort of, but sort of invite us into the language and into learning the language, which was fantastic. So that was really interesting because, again, she she showed us music and these kinds of things, and music for me, at least, I don't know about you, but music was always a great, well, tool in a way to add languages, mop up languages, whatever you want to call it. It was a great learning tool for me, particularly when it comes to French, because certainly for a German, French pronunciation is not that easy, especially in the beginning. So you really have to know how to move your mouth and lips and everything to make it work so much better. And I found music incredibly helpful for that. It's just, singing along, being able to get the pronunciation right, but also learning a lot of new words, obviously, and phrases and turns of phrases. And all these things. So I'm thinking if you just said you're about to start a new chorus. I'm imagining that music was also helpful for you when picking up new languages.
You know, maybe it's the other way around, actually. I think it was that all of the languages that I spoke were helpful for me in singing, even in singing in languages that I don't speak, because you can if you've already learned the sound system, right, the phonemes of a certain language, it really helps you for moving to another language. So I don't think I actually listened to all that much music in foreign languages, but when it came time to learn Portuguese, it was very easy for me to wrap my head around most of the sounds because the sounds actually are very similar to the sounds in Catalan. Some people might choose to, might beg to differ on that one, but that's my general feeling about it. So that was sort of how I found my relationship with music. I mean, since we're talking about how we learn languages, I think it might be interesting to talk about the different approaches that we have had to learning languages, and especially, well, let's start with just learning languages, and then maybe we'll talk about how you get a language up to the degree, the degree of fluency you need to interpret from it, because I think that those are two very different things.
Very much so.
And so for me, language learning has just always been about engaging with the language, and primarily my main way of learning was by speaking. That's the kind of learner I am. I hear something and I usually just pick it up. A bit of a sponge for languages, so I hear it once, I hear it maybe twice. I might have to ask how you write it occasionally, and then it clicks, and that's it for me. And so I think that it's not about the music, it's about interacting in the language, which is why for me it's quite strange that some colleagues, when they're learning a new language, a C language, right, they say, well, I don't actually need to be able to speak this language, which is just kind of jarring for me.
Well, at least
Uh,
not that well, yeah.
for me, it just doesn't work because for me, the way I
Mm.
learn a language is by speaking it, by interacting with people, by engaging with people, by going to the country if possible, but if not, by finding lots of opportunities to practice in real life. What about you?
Yeah, I think I'm different that way. I mean, I have no shame, if you will, about striking up a conversation, even if it's a language that I don't speak particularly well. I mean, I live in Brussels, and I have French in my language combination, but Dutch is a big language here as well. So I sometimes find myself just kind of faking a conversation in Dutch. And Dutch is not one of my working languages, but just to demonstrate the fact that I'm not, I have no problem with starting a conversation. But I think I'm more of a person that sort of absorbs language. So of course I listen to a lot of podcasts in all my languages, music. I said that already, but I think I'm less focused on speaking the language, at least in the beginning of the process, I think. And also the big problem that I have is I'm a very lazy language learner, if that makes sense. So I've always hated cramming vocab and learning sort of vocabulary by heart and studying grammatical structures. I've always really hated it. The best and most helpful approach for me has always been sort of immersing myself into the language, which usually means just spending time in a country or sort of context where this language is sort of the dominant language, which I think we can talk about a bit later on as well, because we both live abroad and not sort of in our native language. But I think we're a little bit different that way in terms of how we learn. So, for example, I've started working with Duolingo, but it wasn't for me. I didn't feel motivated by the prompts.
Are you implying that I'm learning all of my languages from Duolingo?
No, I was just giving an example for how lazy I am as a language learner, is that even Duolingo, which a lot of people love, and that they're really doing a great job and it's a great app, but it's just not for me. I sort of, even the whole, don't break the chain and keep your streak alive, and I just couldn't care less.
So gamification is not your thing.
Not for me. Not at all.
You are a learner who is driven by intrinsic motivation, to put it in
I guess you could put it that way. Yes.
Jargon, rather than somebody who's driven by extrinsic motivation. My partner, on the other hand, for him, it is absolutely about that gamification, and he does not want to miss a day of his Duolingo. I mean, there are times that we're even at a dinner party at 11:50, and you go, I have to step out for 10 minutes so I can do my Duolingo.
Yeah. Well, good for him.
Absolutely.
I admire that in a way.
Yeah. What about when it comes time to learning a language at professional level? Are there other things that you tend to do there? I mean, yeah, you start and then I'll flesh it out.
Yeah, I don't really know what to say. I think I'm a person who would then at some point sort of jump into the just do it approach. So I would probably start just working with practice speeches, beginning with a fairly simple level and then sort of moving my way sort of up the difficulty scale, I guess. That's about it. I think I don't have a particularly sophisticated approach to language learning, I just realized.
Huh. So it's quite interesting for me because I'm learning, well, when I did my master's in conference interpreting, I had to learn a lot about conference vocabulary, which is very different. I mean, I went in with what I thought was strong Italian because I'd been living in Italy for many years, and I realized I had strong street Italian, but very poor conference Italian because they're two completely different ball games. And so
there's a lot of people nodding along right now.
I'm sure there are, but that probably applies to most of our languages. I mean, to a greater or lesser extent. So one of the things that I realized early on is that I needed to do a lot of reading of more high-level texts, more bureaucraties, yes, definitely. I mean, when I trained for the UN exam, it was all UNEs, and it's quite different. But I mean, some of you may have watched, you probably know that Alex and I run a little venture called Techforward, and we have posted plenty of videos about technology, and one of them is about how I trained for the UN exam. If you haven't seen it, feel free to check it out. And in that,
season's coming up, right? There are new tests on the horizon, as far as I can tell.
I think that the deadline is this week for the English booth. Absolutely. And for the first time, they're doing it completely virtually, which is also an interesting development. But what I was going to say about that is one of the things that I found most useful for getting my own English up was listening to other interpreters working into my native language, which I think is a real challenge when we're living abroad, when you're not necessarily engaging in your native language every day. I mean, of course I speak English at some point every day, but it's not 24/7, 365, which would be the case, more, at least more of the case if I were in the US. Now
Yep.
I probably speak almost every one of my languages almost every day, which is pretty cool, very neat, but also a challenge for maintaining the degree of English you need. And also because, I mean, some people, I think many colleagues are struck by the fact that I have two very different registers. So when you and I are chatting and when I'm teaching, it's very informal. And then I turn on the microphone in the booth and all of a sudden I become this very serious professional Josh. I mean, of course, I'm ready to reel off idioms if appropriate for the venue that I'm working at. And maybe we'll talk about that in a second. But they're different registers and you have to maintain both of them, I think. Is that your experience too, Alex?
Yeah, I think keeping it up is really, really difficult, and or at least more difficult than when you're in your normal environment, as it were. So I'm seeing the same thing with myself, although the difference in my case is that I have a partner and a family speaking the same language, so we're all native speakers around here in the house, which helps. But that, of course, as you said, is sort of a particular register. Is I kind of know it as kitchen German, or kitchen X, whatever the language is. But you get the idea. It's the everyday sort of kind of language you use around the house and with friends and family. So there's a particular effort required to sort of get to the level that you need for interpreting, international conferences and international communication. So that's a challenge in and of itself. And I don't know about you, Josh. I assume it's similar, but for sort of more senior colleagues who have been in this situation for a longer time, you can sometimes spot these little things that are not really. That's not really how we say that in Germany or Austria, for that matter. They have these, sometimes calques or just things that they've picked up or that have come onto the scene, if you will, while they were already abroad. So, for older colleagues, it can be things like new technological developments, internet and stuff like that, which they're not as familiar with in their own, native tongue for some reason. So that can be interesting to observe. But of course, as an interpreter, it's definitely a challenge. But this is much easier nowadays, I think. Especially in the age of practice groups online like this, to find authentic material, good material at various levels that you can use to practice with. I mean, this was much more difficult when I was at university. We were still using tapes actually, and it was really tricky to find authentic speeches, especially also speeches that are not sort of the main variety of a given language. So, for example, it would have been much more difficult to find something in Australian English or, a Japanese person speaking English. That would have been impossible to find, which is much easier nowadays, which is great, by the way, because it enables us to also pick up these sort of non-standard or just different varieties of our working languages, which is something that also not every interpreter necessarily is very comfortable with. I don't know if you've made a similar experience, Josh, particularly with English. I mean, there's so many varieties now.
Well, I think that's definitely the case, including plenty of people speaking non-native English, right? Globish, as it's often called. And beyond that, I do think that, I mean, a lot of my work is for the UN, and for that purpose, I come across people from every single country where my languages are spoken, which is not necessarily the same for you at the EU. I mean, over the years, you probably do,
Totally. Yep.
but I hear much more Latin American Spanish, for example, or African French,
Brazilian
Canadian,
Portuguese. Yep.
Canadian French, variants of Portuguese than you probably do. And I think that is another interesting challenge that interpreters face. I mean, since we're talking about differences between working at the UN and working at the EU, I think it's also worth mentioning, some colleagues may not agree with me on this point, but I'm just like you work differently for different colleagues, or different audiences rather, you probably work differently in different settings. I mean, I talked about changing my register. If I'm interpreting this speech, I would probably be going for something, well, what would I call my style?
More colloquial.
Casual, colloquial, but rich. I really try to trot out my idioms whenever possible, and I hope you're having fun with those. But I find actually that when I'm working For example, at the European Parliament, a lot of the time it is more idiomatic and colloquial, but when I'm working at the United Nations, depending on the setting, but if they're reading out a text, definitely, it's going to be far more formulaic. And I think that that's a challenge. Plus, then those of us from across the pond have the challenge of figuring out which variant of English we're going to speak. And I certainly have heard feedback from time to time saying, well, Josh, you might want to use the words we're used to hearing around here, which, you know, I'm not fully convinced about this because, to be completely honest,
Let me guess, those comments usually come from colleagues, not delegates.
I've never heard it from a delegate. Yeah.
Yeah.
The worst though is transport, or as I would say, transportation readings, because pretty much every word is different. You know, trucks and lorries and articulated lorries are called semis for us. And you know, what do they say, windscreen is the dashboard. And I mean, I could go on and on, but I think people are probably hating this from an interpreting point of view. So I'll spare you that, and maybe we can transition to talking. You know, I think we should be wrapping up pretty soon, but we can't possibly end without talking about why we decided to call this talk Tech Forward Heart Emoji Words. So, I mean, Alex, you're a huge emoji fan, and you have been for many years. Tell us about why and what emojis mean for you.
I really suffer when I'm on Zoom meetings because Zoom doesn't have native support for emoji. So that's kind of difficult because, it's sort of become part and parcel of how I express myself. I don't know why, it's just really clicked for me. I mean, as these things tend to happen in life, sometimes you just pick up on something because it feels right. And that's definitely the case for emoji, but also for GIFs, or GIFs, as you would say, Josh. So I've just really embraced that because, especially for online communication, which is often very concise, and maybe you're out and about on the bus and, you know, Josh needs a quick reply from me, so I'll just give him a thumbs up or you know, a smile or whatever when there's something to celebrate, some milestone or whatever it may be. So that's been really interesting for me. But what's also been very interesting, sort of looking at emoji in a more structured way, is to see how, you know, particular emojis or I don't know, emojis, is that the right plural? I don't even know how they get picked up and what thanks, Josh, and what they're used for.
I was responding with an emoji.
Yeah,
actually two, a thumbs up and a big smile.
A real life emoji, exactly. So interesting to see how they get picked up and how they are used. You know, also across different generations and age groups. You know, like the peach emoji and stuff like that. Not to go into too much detail there, but that's interesting because it's almost like a shibboleth. You know, something that gives older people away if they just use a peach emoji. Literally, figuratively, I don't know, that'll give them away. So I find that incredibly interesting to observe, and there's websites out there like Emojipedia that sort of track all of that and look at the different implementations across platforms. So that's kind of interesting for the technology geek in me, is to see, you know, how emoji get drawn differently onto platforms. So it's just an endlessly fascinating topic for me. And well, and GIFs, of course, are just great. They're huge on Twitter, so of course I'll use them.
You know, it's funny that you approach emojis from the technology geek point of view. I wear a different hat when I'm looking at emojis, and I think about it from a linguistic point of view. You know, for me, it's fascinating. I said I studied historical linguistics, and the part of historical linguistics I'm most interested in actually is completely unrelated to ancient history. It's how the language is changing right now. And I think emojis are having a huge impact on how language is changing. They actually give rise to what in technical jargon are called idiolects. So I would even venture to say that you and I have our own little idiolect on Slack because we use certain emojis in certain ways after using them so many times. You know, okay, this one means yes, this one means no, this one means thank you, this one means this is a completely lame idea. Not usually your idea, somebody else's
we all
ideas.
know which emoji this is.
So I am absolutely fascinated by the way emojis are changing language. And I think, you know, we've come full circle. That's why we decided to call this talk Tech Forward Heart Emoji Words.
It's a new language we're picking up, right? Emoji.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, I hope you've all enjoyed hearing from us with us wearing a different hat, not geeking out about technology, but rather geeking out about languages.
Everybody's going to be so disappointed we didn't talk about tech, but it was really lovely and a very enjoyable conversation. Thanks for having us on.